choir soloists, etc. Of course, all that had to be cancelled. Hopefully we'll have that next year. And this year we focused on Beethoven because, of course, as you know, it is his 250th anniversary of his birth. We are very thankful for our sponsors, without whom these events would not be possible. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the sponsorship from Arts Council Malta, who have been sponsoring Victoria International Arts Festival for a number of years now. This event and Saturday's event are sponsored by the Valletta Cultural Agency, so thank you, Catherine Tabone, for that. And last but not least, Teatro Manuel, who have been extremely generous and cooperative on everything we needed this evening. So this brings me to the talk which Professor James Corby will be giving, something about James. He's Associate Professor and Head of the Department of English at the University of Malta, where he lectures on literary theory, poetry, and philosophy. He's the founding co-editor of Countertext, a journal for the study of the post-literary, which is published by Edinburgh University Press. This publication is now in its 6th year. He's also a founding member of the Futures of Literature Network, a research network based in Malta. Has published widely on literature and philosophy, including articles on Romanticism, modernism, phenomenology, performance, politics, literary theory, and contemporary literature. He co-edited Style in Theory Between Literature and Philosophy, published by Bloomsbury in 2013 with Ivanka Luce, who is present with us, and Gloria Lauri Lucente. And he has also edited a special issue of the Journal for Cultural Research on Critical Distance, published by Taylor and Francis, 2017. He has given guest lectures and invited talks at numerous leading universities, and most recently interviewed acclaimed novelist Salman Rushdie at the Malta Book Festival 2020. Before we start, on behalf of my brother, who is the artistic director of the festival, we would like to extend our sincere condolences to the family of Professor Oliver Frigieri, who always kept tabs on what we were doing, always asking me when we met on the corridor, Shemis, what's next? And I recall those meetings, those short exchanges of conversation with great gratitude and affection. So James will be speaking on the joy of suffering overcome, struggle and freedom from the Enlightenment to Romanticism. Welcome, James, please. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you here at the Manuel and those of you following online. I can't say what an honor it is to be invited to contribute to the Victoria International Arts Festival. I'm a huge admirer of the festival and of the incredible work that Dr. Maria Frendo and the late but much missed Maestro Joseph Vella and the whole team have put into it over the years. So I'm really delighted to be playing a small part in it this year. I'd like to echo Maria's acknowledgements of the Valletta Cultural Agency and Arts Council Malta for their generous support of the event. We are, of course, celebrating the 250th anniversary of Ludwig van Beethoven's birth. I certainly won't attempt to offer any critique or appraisal of Beethoven's legacy. There are people here eminently more qualified than I am to do that. What I will try to do, however, is to give an insight into some of the ideas and intellectual attitudes that were in the air at the time. And what a time it was. One could, of course, argue that Beethoven's singular achievements stand on their own and do not require historical or philosophical contextualization. One's enjoyment of the music would remain undimmed without them. Art, however, even that of Beethoven, does not emerge from a vacuum. Born in 1770, Beethoven lived a mere 56 years, dying in 1827. He was, according to legend, defiant till the end, shaking his fist at a spring thunderstorm as he lay on his deathbed. As lifespans go, 56 years is certainly not long. But think about those years, 1770 to 1827, in terms of European history, and it should immediately be apparent just how tumultuous and consequential that span of time was. It encompasses world historical shifts in politics, philosophy, and the arts. and it is my belief that some understanding of this can only heighten one's appreciation of Beethoven's achievements. The title of my talk is indeed The Joy of Suffering Overcome, Struggle and Freedom from the Enlightenment to Romanticism. But in a talk such as this, there's only so much ground that can be covered. And so I'm going to focus on one key individual, someone who was as much a part of the age as Beethoven was. That person is poet, philosopher, historian, and playwright Friedrich Schiller. Born in 1759, 11 years before Beethoven, and dying from tuberculosis in 1805 at the age of 45, Schiller will always be associated with Beethoven primarily because of the gargantuan and stupendous Ninth Symphony, which famously includes a choral setting of Schiller's 1785 poem An der Freude, Ode to Joy, in the climactic fourth movement. Not only is the Ninth Symphony regarded by many as Beethoven's crowning achievement, it is arguably the most important artwork of all Western music. And the choral setting of the Ode to Joy, whose melody is a simple but memorable 5 notes, has transcended even that stellar acclaim to become, in its own right, one of the most culturally resonant and recognizable expressions of humanity the world has ever known. It is, for instance, the supranational anthem of the European Union. It was chosen for a special Christmas concert marking the demolition of the Berlin Wall. It is performed to mark the year's end in Japan. It was sung in Chile during the demonstrations against the Pinochet regime, and Chinese students broadcast it during the Tiananmen Square protests. And from A Clockwork Orange to Die Hard, Ode to Joy is a mainstay of popular culture. So given the triumphant success of the Ninth Symphony and the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony in particular, the most obvious thematic connection between Schiller and Beethoven would be joy. Joy, however, is an extreme emotion that can only be felt as such relative either to its lack or to its opposite. That is to say, we can only truly know what joy is if we have experienced the stark absence of joy, the impossibility of joy. And I would argue that for both Schiller and Beethoven, and indeed for their age, joy and its opposite, suffering or struggle, are bound closely together. And to understand the full significance of the one, you must understand the full significance of the other. Hence the title of this talk, The Joy of Suffering Overcome. I've taken that phrase from Romain Rolland's 1927 biography, Beethoven the Creator. Roland writes, I quote, "In painting his portrait, I paint that of his stock, our century, our dream, ourselves, and our companion with bleeding feet, joy. Not the gross joy of the soul that gorges itself in its stable, but the joy of ordeal, of pain, of battle, of suffering overcome, of victory over oneself, the joy of destiny subdued, espoused, fecundated." Roland's biography feeds into and propagates the idea of Beethoven the demigod, Beethoven the tragic genius. That is to say, the cult of Beethoven, which took hold with astonishing purchase in the 19th century. And so a good deal of this myth-making is myth-making, but there is some evidence that Beethoven too thought in terms of hard-won joy, and that to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat was, in keeping with the heroic ideals of the age, the ideal achievement. As Beethoven comments in a letter in 1815, "The best of us obtain joy through suffering." So although joy seems to be what connects Schiller and Beethoven, much of my focus today will be on the crises and struggles that ultimately establish the conditions that allow joy to be set off in its true brilliance. Joy of this sort, in contrast with more naive forms of joy, signifies maturation, which can only be achieved through the overcoming of obstacles. The narrative is akin to that of a Bildungsroman, or, more appropriately in the context of Schiller, an aesthetic education. But first, joy in its naive or immature guise. For both Schiller and Beethoven, any joy of this sort was perfectly in keeping with the exuberance and confidence of the age. We are talking, of course, of the Enlightenment and Aufklärung optimism and activism, which reached something of a peak in the 1780s. The end of the decade saw the widespread revolutionary fervour climax with the revolution in France, but the start of the decade was no less extraordinary. Take 1781, for instance. There was the premiere of Schiller's play The Robbers, which embodied the turbulent spirit of Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, the name given to the German artistic movement, which, in exploring the passion of the inner world of emotion, started to challenge the Enlightenment emphasis on reason. In Vienna, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II issued decrees that abolished serfdom in Austria and proclaimed religious tolerance. Immanuel Kant published the Critique of Pure Reason, ushering in a new chapter in the history of philosophy. Haydn published his Russian string quartets. Mozart premiered his tragic opera, Idomeneo. And a new esoteric society calling itself the Order of Illuminati issued its general statutes. It was also at this time that the young Beethoven began his studies with Christian Gottlob Nefer, a keen advocate of Goethe and Schiller and the poets and dramatists of the Sturm und Drang. A couple of years later, in 1784, Kant writes an essay called Answering the Question, What is Enlightenment? And argues that, I quote, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Dare to know, sapere aude, he writes, have the courage to use one's own understanding. At the heart of this Enlightenment ideal is freedom. As Kant writes, I quote, the Enlightenment requires nothing but freedom. And the most innocent of all that may be the most innocent of all that may be called freedom. Freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. The public use of one's reason must be free at all times, and this alone can bring enlightenment to mankind. And then, right in the middle of this remarkable decade, Friedrich Schiller caught the spirit of the age in the ecstatic verses of the Ode to Joy. The poem's essence was the Enlightenment cult of happiness as the goal of life, the conviction that the triumph of freedom and joy would bring humanity to an epoch of peace and universal brotherhood, the utopia he called Elysium. I'll quote a few lines to give you a sense of the Ode to Joy. Joy, thou lovely God-engendered daughter of Elysium, drunk with fire we enter, heavenly one, thy holy shrine. Thy magic reunites what fashion has broken apart. Beggars will be princes' brothers, where thy gentle wing abides. Be embraced, you millions, this kiss for the whole world. Brothers, over the starry canopy a loving father must dwell. Whoever has had the great success to be a friend of a friend, he who has won a sweet wife, join our jubilation. Brothers, drink and join the song, all sinners shall be forgiven, all hell shall be no more. You get the idea. Schiller's poem is in the German tradition of the social song, the Geselligeslied, intended literally or figuratively to be sung among comrades with glasses raised. The verses themselves are drunken and reeling with hope. In dozens of musical settings, An der Freude was sung in Freemason lodges all over Germany and by young revolutionaries in the streets. For Beethoven, and for many of his era, these verses were the very distillation of the revolutionary 1780s. By the end of his teens, Beethoven was determined to compose his own setting of the poem. Perhaps he did, but if so, the attempt did not survive. When he took up An der Freude again, decades later, those verses still rang for him with joy, but it was a joy changed, a joy deepened, and if anything rendered more resonant and impassioned because of how hard-won it had ultimately proved to be. The various trials and tribulations in Beethoven's life that transform his relationship to the idea of joy cannot be recounted here, but I'd like to zoom in briefly on an episode midway through his life that is rightly considered to be pivotal. At the turn of the 19th century, Beethoven's hearing was beginning to deteriorate quite severely. And around April 1802, at the age of 31, on the advice of his doctor, he retired for a planned stay of 6 months to the quiet and beautiful village of Heiligenstadt, one of the villages amid the trees and vineyards of the Vienna woods, a few miles from the city. His doctor wanted him to rest his ears and regain some health and strength, and Beethoven arrived eager and full of hope that this cure amid the beauty of nature would restore his health and his spirit, and maybe even stop the decline of his hearing. Beethoven's summer in Heiligenstadt proved extremely productive, but alas, his hearing continued to deteriorate. And after years of denial and defiance and desperate appeals to doctors, his defenses gave way and he found himself filled with despair. This was Beethoven's dark night of the soul, and it produced a remarkable letter dated 6th October 1802, addressed to his brothers Johann and Caspar. The letter has come to be known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. Although the letter is full of raw emotion and suffering, it was not scribbled down like most of his correspondence tended to be. Rather, it was considered, sketched, then written out in fair copy. It may have been intended to be found after his death from age, or illness, or accident, or sooner by his own hand. A few days after writing it, he adds a frenzied addendum to the letter. This letter, the Heiligenstadt Testament, became one of the talismans Beethoven kept always with him. It was, as one biographer puts it, a keepsake from lost joy in life. Likely over the years, he took the letter out of its hiding place in his desk, unfolded it, and read it over to remind himself what he had resolved his life was to be and why, and how close he had come to death before he created his true work. For those of you not familiar with the letter, let me read out a few passages to give you a sense of it. It's a truly remarkable document. For my brothers, Karl and... Well, he leaves a space here. He can't, for whatever reason, bring himself to write the name Johann, his other brother. For my brothers, Karl and Beethoven. Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. From childhood on, my heart and soul have been full of the tender feeling of goodwill, and I was ever inclined to accomplish great things. But think that for 6 years now, I have been hopelessly afflicted, made much worse by senseless doctors, from year to year, deceived with hopes of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady, whose cure will take years or perhaps be impossible. Though born with a fiery, active temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was soon compelled to withdraw myself to live life alone. If at times I tried to forget all this, oh, how harshly I was flung back by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing. Yet it was impossible for me to say to people, "Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf." Ah, how could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others? A sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection, a perfection such as few in my profession enjoy or have ever enjoyed. I must live alone like an exile. Thus it has been during the last 6 months which I have spent in the country. By ordering me to spare my hearing as much as possible, my intelligent doctor almost fell in with my own present frame of mind, though sometimes I ran counter to it by yielding to my desire for comradeship. But what a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance, and I heard nothing. Or someone heard a shepherd singing, and again I heard nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that, and I would have ended my life. There was arguably a good deal of deliberate self-dramatization here, but his admission that he has been brought to the brink of suicide seems genuine. There is, in any case, little reason to doubt it. This, then, is the depths of suffering, the complete antithesis of joy. What, we might wonder, prevented him in the end from taking his own life? Well, the Heiligenstadt Testament goes on to answer that question. I quote, "It was only my art that held me back. Oh, it seemed impossible to me to leave this world before I had produced all that I felt capable of producing, and so I prolonged this wretched existence, truly wretched for so susceptible a body that a sudden change can plunge me from the best into the worst of states." Though he would not take his own life, he concludes the letter by saying, "With joy I hasten to meet death." And so concludes the letter written on 6th October. But then, on the 10th of October, he adds an addendum to the testament. This is not carefully drafted like the previous portion of the letter. Indeed, it is scribbled, full of dashes, and gives the general impression of breathlessness. This, then, is his true cri de coeur. He writes, "O Providence, grant me at last but one day of pure joy. It is so long since real joy echoed in my heart." It would be over 2 decades before he was to mount his full and triumphant expression of joy in the Ninth Symphony, but his breakdown at Heiligenstadt, that's what it was, which was also a moment of clarity, where facing despair he resolves to live on for the sake of his art, marks a decisive turning point. He seems to understand that if he stands any chance of regaining joy of the sort expressed by Schiller, it would be through art alone. The pattern of his life changed once and for all. The old confidence became complex. Now he was at the mercy of something he had never encountered before, a malevolent fate beyond the force of his will. This marks Beethoven's own maturation, his own enlightenment, and this is signaled nowhere more strongly than in his Symphony No. 3, the Eroica, composed mainly in 1803 to 1804. Before this, he had essentially been a composer of the 18th century, but with the Eroica, music entered the age of Romanticism. While the suffering that transformed Beethoven, that provoked him to a maturation in which his orientation to joy was radically recontextualized, was primarily personal, for Schiller, the joy-denying crises and struggles that came to preoccupy him were more social, cultural, and philosophical, more, in fact, a direct reflection of the age. When Schiller penned the Ode to Joy in 1785, he, like many others, was full of optimism and revolutionary fervor. And the French Revolution in 1789 seemed, at least at first, like a manifestation and extension of Enlightenment ideals. That the revolution signaled an epoch-defining shift was immediately clear to most writers and intellectuals in Germany. It was impossible not to be touched by the emotion of the historical moment. "Such a phenomenon in human history," wrote Kant, "will never be forgotten, because it has uncovered an aptitude and faculty for improvement in human nature of the sort that no political mind could have inferred from the course of things up to that point." Like Kant, Hegel too dated the French Revolution as the start of a new epoch in human history. I quote, "Never since the sun had stirred in the firmament and the planets revolved around it, had it been perceived that man's existence centers in his head, i.e. in thought, inspired by which he builds up the world of reality." Intellectuals saw the revolution as the primal scene of action for the grounding of a new society. What Rousseau and other social contract theorists of the Enlightenment had up until this point projected back into an abstract prehistory now seemed to be playing itself out before their very eyes in an immediately graspable present. Schiller too had first hailed the revolution, but was then repelled by its further course, in particular the September massacres of 1792, when almost 2,000 people were slaughtered by the Parisian mob and after the execution of the king. All of the joyous promise that it had once held dissipated to be replaced by nightmarish violence and social and economic chaos. These developments compounded and confirmed for Schiller a growing dissatisfaction with the ideals of the Enlightenment and made clear to him that joy was not going to be as easily won as he had perhaps hoped. He channeled his disillusion into a remarkably productive period of philosophical reflection in the first half of the 1790s. In fact, this is really the only time when Schiller can be understood as a philosopher. After about 1795, 1796, he writes that he has closed the philosophical shop. The crowning result of this was his letters on the aesthetic education of man. Here, he denounces the immaturity of the revolutionaries, I quote. Man has roused himself from his long indolence and his self-deception, and by an impressive majority is demanding restitution of his inalienable rights. There seems to be a physical possibility of setting law upon the throne, of honoring man at last as an end in himself, and making true freedom the basis of political association. Vain hope. The moral possibility is lacking, and a moment so prodigal of opportunity finds a generation unprepared to receive it. So the opportunity is squandered. Crucially, Schiller sees this flawed reality as a direct consequence of what he now judges to be the Enlightenment's mistaken focus on reason as the key to human freedom. He writes, "The enlightenment of the mind, which is not altogether the not altogether groundless boast of our refined classes, has had on the whole so little of an ennobling influence on feeling and character that it has tended rather to bolster up depravity by providing it with the support of precepts." Schiller judged the Europeans of the time to be unprepared to receive the revolution as an opportunity because they were inwardly unfree. But what might it mean to be inwardly free? Well, one should not be dependent upon desires, regardless of whether one is attached to them on the crude and uncivilized level or on that of civilized refinement. In both cases, man remains ruled by his nature without being able to rule himself. But was this not an age of enlightenment and science, a time when the free and inquiring spirit was flourishing? No, says Schiller, we should not overestimate the accomplishments of the age. Enlightenment and science had been revealed to be merely intellectual education, an external affair for inner barbarians. Public reason has not yet grasped and transformed the nucleus of the person. Mankind, that is to say, is out of balance. Schiller recalled the ideal of Greek paideia, which consisted in reaching an equilibrium between reason on the one hand and feeling or sensibility on the other. That way lies joy worthy of Elysium. However, as through the ages education became more one-sidedly intellectual, it began to neglect man's sensuous needs, and the Enlightenment marked the extreme tendency of this development. Well before the 1790s, the leading thinkers of the Sturm und Drang, Hamann, Herder, and so on, had criticized the traditional Aufklärung for failing to provide a proper education for the people. The Aufklärer of the Leibnizian Wolffian school had defined enlightenment in terms of imparting knowledge, of spreading clear and distinct concepts among the public, as if education were only a matter of cultivating the intellect. But to its critics, such a program of education suffered from two serious shortcomings. First, it did not encourage thinking for oneself or spontaneity of thought, because it presupposed that someone else had already done all the thinking. Second, and even more problematically, it presumed that if people did understand the principles taught to them, that they would be willing and able to act according to them. But such fatuous intellectualism ignored the classical problem of akrasia, that even if we know the good, we might not act according to it. For all these thinkers, the revolution provided striking confirmation of this diagnosis. The philosophe in France had been preaching the principles of reason to the people for decades. and they had proclaimed constitution after constitution, but all to no avail. The people were not ready for such high principles and lofty ideals. Rather than acting according to the principles of reason, they gave free rein to their own interests and passions, and the catastrophic result was plain for all to see. The lesson to be learned from the failure of the Enlightenment and the chaos of the Revolution, Schiller argued, is that it is not sufficient to educate the understanding alone. It is also necessary to cultivate feelings and desires, to develop a person's sensibility so that he or she is inclined to act according to the principles of reason. In other words, it was also essential to inspire the people, to touch their hearts and to arouse their imaginations, to give them high ideals to live by. Of course, in the past, there had been a remedy for this problem. Religion, with its powerful myths and seductive mysteries, had provided popular incentive to morality because it could appeal directly to the heart and the imagination of the people. But at the end of the 18th century, this traditional source of moral authority was on the wane and indeed on the verge of collapse. Here, the Aufklärung had been only too successful. Its ruthless and relentless criticism of the Bible, of the traditional proofs of the existence of God, and of the authority of the clergy had left little standing of the old religion, which was now condemned as prejudice, superstition, and myth. Clearly, there was an enormous vacuum waiting to be filled. In time, that vacuum would come to be filled by Romanticism. T. Hume calls Romanticism spilt religion. Schiller himself was not a romantic as such, but his privileging of art through his conception of an aesthetic education proved hugely influential for the Romantics. So let us look in a bit more detail at Schiller's aesthetic ideas. The first thing to appreciate here is the enormous influence on Schiller of Kant's third critique, the Critique of Judgment, published in 1790. The imbalance that Schiller had diagnosed between reason and sensibility seemed, in the philosophy of Kant, to have been rendered, albeit unintentionally, as a thoroughgoing diremption. In the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant had attempted to determine the limits and scope of metaphysics, all of which concerned the ways in which we, human beings, are bound by necessity. In the second critique, the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant sets out his moral philosophy and explores the ways in which we, human beings, are free to act. The Critique of Judgment is Kant's attempt to bring these two realms together by means of aesthetics. A Kantian in spirit, if not in letter, Schiller was inspired by the third critique to turn to aesthetics as a potentially unifying and mediating force. But he judged Kant not to have gone far enough, consequently leaving philosophy's conception of the human being split between freedom and necessity, between, that is, freedom and nature. This may be the most elevated philosophical expression of the internal schism in man, who finds his faculties opposed to each other, but Schiller sees it as a broader characteristic of modern culture, and indeed his analysis of the division of labor in society articulates one of the very earliest critiques of alienation from a materialist perspective. I quote Schiller: "Eternally fettered to only one single fragment of the whole, man develops himself only fragmentarily. Eternally listening to the monotonous noise of the wheel that he drives, he never develops the harmony of his nature, and instead of modeling himself after the idea of humanity, he becomes the mere imprint of his occupation, his science." Although Schiller is here emerging strongly as a counter-Enlightenment figure, he still has enough of a foot in the Enlightenment to believe that it would be a mistake, indeed it would be impossible, for us to step back to that supposedly ideal state of classical Greece and be wholly integrated people in a harmonious community again. That Edenic state was also a naive state, a state of immaturity. Our historical progress has been an awakening and enlightening, and we have passed from innocence to experience, never to return. And so if we cannot go back, we must go forward and complete our maturation. We must, that is to say, grow up, where growing up means acceding to an ideal state, one in which we are balanced and unified both as self-conscious individuals, but also, even more importantly, as a moral community. To Schiller, it is clear that a direct transition to individual and social maturity is impossible. Both the Enlightenment and the Revolution were in their own ways attempts at this, and both ended in failure or worse. There therefore needs to be a third element that mediates the transition from naivety to the ideal. It is precisely this function that the aesthetic state is conceived to fulfill. Aesthetic education is at its outset the complement of enlightenment and the avoidance of revolutionary violence. Art, therefore, is assigned a very concrete historical function in this scheme. And yet Schiller's aesthetic philosophy is incomplete without its formal aspect that investigates the nature of mankind apart from his social deformation. And here we must turn briefly to Schiller's theory of drives, which introduces another of the series of opposites that he deals with and which end up having to be mediated by a third term. Man, according to Schiller's theory, this theory of drives is influenced by Fichte, anyway. Man, according to Schiller's theory, is governed by two drives that are both complementary and oppositional. The first is called the Stofftrieb, the sense drive. It is determined by sensuality, perception, and the primacy of the matter of the world over the ego. Since the ego is responsible for organizing the sense impressions, it is constantly threatened by the sense drive's anarchic onslaught up to the point of its complete dissolution. Man, under the rule of the sense drive, is devoid of individuality. For this ego, there is no freedom. Opposed to this, complementary to it also in a way, is the Formtrieb, the form drive. This results from the unchangeable part of man. Whereas the sensual ego is determined by sensuality, the self operates under the principles of reason. Against constant change, it pitches its own atemporality, and against matter, form. Whereas the sense drive receives data, the form drive impresses form on that data. Since both of these drives inhabit distinct spheres, they cannot directly interact with each other. And yet both of them require restriction, because the uninhibited development of either drive would result in self-destruction. Schiller posits the will as that which keeps them both in check. But this, the will, on its own is not sufficient. In order to overcome man's fragmentation, they need to be mediated. Such mediation Schiller finds in the Spieltrieb, the play drive, that is able to unify time and atemporality, becoming and being, change and identity. And here, in the context of our discussion of joy and suffering, is a crucial quotation from Schiller. I quote, "Reason demands, on transcendental grounds, that a partnership between the sense drive and the form drive should exist, namely a play drive, because only the union of reality with form, of contingency with necessity, of suffering with freedom, fulfills the conception of humanity. This play drive, which brings together suffering with freedom, and therefore with joy, is nothing other than the aesthetic principle. The principle, we might say, which was the determining factor in Beethoven's decision not to give in fully to despair, not to take his own life. The term play refers to the contemplation of the beautiful that frees man both from the atemporality of the law and from sensual desire by situating him between both. Man takes seriously both the pleasure of the senses and the perfection of the moral law, but beauty is devoid of such earnestness. Beauty is the object of play. In play, man expresses his complete nature, no longer divided into sensuality and morality. As Schiller famously writes, I quote, "Man plays only when he is in the full sense of the word a man, and he is only wholly man when he is playing." Beauty, therefore, is the freedom of the play drive. Only beauty can manifest the union of the rational and the real, the person and his or her temporal states, causality and indeterminacy. Beautiful objects seem to us as if they'd broken away from causality and had their raison d'etre purely in themselves. Schiller calls the joy that we take in such objects love. There is something utopian, then, in the potential that such beauty holds. It is a force that opens a space on its own terms, a playful space in which we are free from a playful space in which we are free, and from which perspective what is might be reimagined afresh or reimagined otherwise. Artworks perceived to possess this quality, a kind of aesthetic autonomy, thus seems to take on a supreme political and philosophical importance and promise the possibility of the establishment of a sensuous moral community. And it is this line of thinking that will be seized on and developed further by the Romantics. The narrative arc of Schiller's thinking has gone from naive joy to crisis and despair, only to be fortified and equipped by aesthetics to proceed to a mature, integrated realization of a fully embodied joy delivered to us through the autonomous, total work of art. And it is in and through such art that we can glimpse the full potential of our humanity. But what would that total work of art look or sound like? Well, I'd suggest that here I should stop talking, and at the first opportunity we should listen again to Beethoven's Magnificent Ninth. Thank you.
Hello, is this working? Thank you. Thank you, Professor Corby, for a wonderful lecture, which I think, frankly speaking for myself, I needed very much. So if there are any questions that you would like to address to Dr. Corby, Professor Corby, sorry, please do so. Perhaps I could start and say, well, it's more of a comment. I can't see well because of the lights, I'm sorry.
Ivan.
Thanks very much, James. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
Do you see in late Romanticism, in the late period of Romanticism, and then the emergence of aestheticism, any tendency to what might be thought of almost as vulgarization of these great ideas of Schiller? It's almost like a sketching out of the broad views that Schiller brought, but then perhaps do you think there was the same philosophical depth and rigor, would you say, in late Romanticism, possibly even later in the work of somebody like Pater and the last bit of the Renaissance?
It's a very interesting question. I think the seeds of that kind of critique are probably in Schiller already, because Schiller's understanding of beauty is essentially contentless. All pace. All art aspires to the condition of music. I mean, what we're straining towards there is music as a kind of anti-representational art form. And one of the things that's so powerful for Schiller in art is its capacity to be entirely other, entirely apart. He talks about the Juno Ludovisi, the gigantic sort of Roman bust, which Rancière picks up more recently to talk about. And in that example, it is its impassivity. It's the sense that the spectator gets, Schiller thinks in the 15th letter, of the spectator's irrelevance, you know, the indifference of the artwork to our existence. You know, I mean, you can see how it's that in itself is kind of influenced by Kant, because, you know, Kant judges beauty as something that we ought to have no direct investment in terms of whether it exists or not. But for Kant, aesthetic judgment always remains ultimately subjective, whereas Schiller is trying to find a kind of objective principle of beauty. But it remains a very, although his aspirations and his ideals are all communal, the experience of the artwork that Schiller sets out is very individual. You know, it's something that you have as an individual, and you're then meant to profit from. But because it's left so indeterminate, it could be seen as empty and vapid and opportunistic. You know, Schmidt's critique of Romanticism kind of runs along these lines. You know, that Romanticism, early German Romanticism, was sort of occasionalist. It was, you know, it was finding occasions and opportunities in the world to espouse their theory, you know, which was a kind of violence to the particularity of the world itself. You know? And then, yes, with the later Romantics, there is then a less philosophically engaged, sort of more exuberant exploration of a kind of romantic aesthetics.
First of all, thank you very much. This was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you kind of partially answered my question when you touched upon Kant. But what I was going to ask you is, you mentioned Schiller's idea of play. Does that engage with or kind of take anything from Kant's idea of aesthetic pleasure as the free play between imagination and kind of cognition?
Yeah, it's a development. It's a development of that from the third critique. So obviously Kant in the third critique sees that sort of free play of the faculties as, you know, putting our full potential as human beings into motion, into a motion which is coherent. And for Schiller, it's this kind of re-articulated version of the same. You know, for Schiller, the two drives that direct us are free when they're brought into this. Into this kind of aesthetic engagement. So they're not directed out into the world in a determinate manner to have a determinate effect. You know, in the way that Kant in the third critique says, you know, we linger, we tarry in front of the artwork. You know, the faculties are put into motion, but they don't resolve. It doesn't resolve into determinative judgment. You know, this is precisely what aesthetic judgment is. We go through the motions, the faculties are exercised, but we do not resolve into a concept. And that's a sort of an early version, I think, of, or Schiller is a late deformation of that idea.
I suppose you mentioned Schiller was looking for a kind of objectivity to as an end to his concept of play, whereas, as you say, Kant's idea of play doesn't kind of resolve in any kind of concept. What would Schiller's ultimate end goal be, or rather than end goal, what would Schiller's kind of concept of play resolve into ultimately?
Well, this is the sort of weak part of the theory that I purposely left out, because it's, you know, it requires a lot of unpacking. I mean, so the pleasure that we take in, you know, for Schiller, the pleasure that we take in that sort of free play of the faculties, he calls love. I think you can partially kind of reconstruct a more compelling program, kind of a moral program from Schiller's thinking if you read him through Hölderlin. who he influenced. But the basic idea is that for Schiller, the experience of the artwork embodies our own freedom, brings us into balance, and it's in that balance that we can live harmoniously as a community and as individuals. The specifics of it aren't really thought out any more than that. As I say, I think you can read a bit more into it if you then go to it through Hölderlin and Hölderlin's idea of love.
Thanks, James. I'd like to ask a question on Schiller's relation, philosophical relation, to two figures, one of them who lived slightly before him, Rousseau, and another figure who lived a few years later, in Nietzsche. Mm-hmm. And the reason I ask is that both Rousseau and Nietzsche, like Schiller, had a particular relation to music. Mm-hmm. Rousseau, apart from his philosophical and political works, I believe also wrote music. Mm-hmm. And there's, of course, Nietzsche's relation to Wagner and the mm-hmm. play between the Apollonian and Dionysian, which seem to be prefigured in Schiller in some mm-hmm. ways. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to Rousseau, I mean, I can just really expand what I briefly hinted at in the talk, which is that, Rousseau was one of the numerous Enlightenment thinkers who roots his understanding of human nature in a kind of projected state of nature. Go back to how man was in the state of nature and then work forwards, and you understand how things like inequality arise and so on. So it kind of contrasts the theorist who projects backwards, whereas for Schiller, prompted, though ultimately disappointed by the revolution, there was more of a sort of forward orientation. With regard to Nietzsche, yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. The second part of a talk like this would have to be on Nietzsche and Wagner, and I think there's a strong case you could make for really close similarities between Schiller's idea of aesthetic pleasure, and the Apollonian. Not the Dionysian, I don't think, but the Apollonian.
Okay, and just a small comment on what you've just said. This question of the Apollonian and Schiller, and then with sort of later you associate there's the revolution, right, which is built on idealism, and it always seems to emerge out of a period of gross disenchantment and letdown and decadence. Mm-hmm. In the revolutions we've had, in the modern world, you think of the British Civil War, the English Civil War, the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution in 1917, and they all emerge out of a sense of profound disengagement with the world. Mm-hmm. And so a dose of idealism seems to be the injection that people are looking for, but then of course it ends in failure. And so the Apollonian degenerates into the Dionysian, it becomes total anarchy.
Yeah. This Schiller's very clear. He thinks that you can't, sort of a moral community cannot be affected directly, whether through education,
yes.
the Enlightenment tried and failed, or whether through revolution.
Yes. The
revolution failed. And so you need to detour. You can't go directly to a sort of moral community, and the detour for him, this edifying experience, is the aesthetic experience.
Yes, exactly, yes, and even post-revolution, Schiller had said, if I remember correctly in one of his letters, that against stupidity, even the gods fight in vain. Yeah. So there you have a sort of testament of what had happened. Anyway, so I think we should spare James. He's been wonderful and really, really engaging, a very, very wonderful talk. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much.
And we look forward to a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in Gozo next year.
Fantastic.
and we'll replay the talk before the actual performance. So please do thank James again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Shakespeare. Oh, thank you.